it's all about projections. You're just a big screen, you know, and it's all being projected on you. I mean, I remember when...
What if the role that made you famous slowly erased who you really were? To the world, he was John-Boy Walton, the golden-hearted dreamer in a simpler, gentler time. But behind that iconic smile, Richard Thomas was quietly drowning in the weight of perfection. Trapped inside a character America refused to let him outgrow, he made a choice most actors wouldn't dare. He walked away, not from fame, but from a version of himself that wasn't real anymore. When Richard Thomas walked away from his iconic role as John-Boy Walton, it left fans in disbelief. To the millions who had come to know and love the Waltons, he wasn't just a character. He was the show's moral anchor, its heart and voice. His sudden replacement by another actor, without much explanation, only deepened the mystery, leaving viewers wondering what would compel such a departure from one of television's most beloved roles. Although it may have appeared like a routine career shift at the time, something common in the entertainment world, the deeper truth would take years to emerge. What fans eventually learned was that Richard's exit was not just about contracts or ambition, but about the personal cost of being tethered so completely to a single role. Before he ever became John Boy, Richard Thomas was an experienced actor with credits spanning Broadway and film, working alongside major names like Julie Christie and Paul Newman. But the Waltons, debuting in 1972 during a time of political unrest and cultural change in America, would alter his life in ways he never imagined. The show, steeped in nostalgia and family values, struck a chord with audiences hungry for emotional grounding. At the center of this emotional heartbeat was John Boy, idealistic, thoughtful, and aspiring to be a writer, who Richard played with natural authenticity drawn from his own upbringing as a bookish child of artistic parents in New York. He infused the character with sincerity and gentle strength, and audiences responded with an almost unprecedented trust and affection. Within 2 seasons, Richard had won an Emmy, was gracing magazine covers, and had become a fixture on television. Fame came fast and hard, but behind the accolades and praise, there was a mounting personal toll. Acting as John Boy ceased to be just a job. It became an identity. With tight filming schedules, endless scripts, and increasing emotional pressure, Richard began to feel creatively confined. The simplicity of the character that once felt grounding began to feel limiting. John Boy remained unwaveringly wholesome and static, while Richard, growing into adulthood, was evolving emotionally and intellectually. The friction between a real man and the public persona created a growing sense of unease. For Richard, who valued introspection over celebrity, the attention was more suffocating than thrilling. Being recognized everywhere as John Boy made the line between the actor and the role blur uncomfortably, not just for fans, but for directors and even colleagues. That image, though beloved, started to feel like a cage, one that rewarded virtue but punished growth. He wasn't allowed to falter or grow darker. John Boy couldn't make mistakes, but Richard needed to. He craved more complex roles, wanted to express deeper emotional layers, but was constantly pulled back into a template of purity and idealism. Media interviews and public appearances often ignored his other work, focusing instead on perpetuating the John Boy myth. The disconnect became emotionally draining. He found himself boxed in, both creatively and professionally, as directors hesitated to see him in anything but the gentle, kind-hearted mountain boy. This typecasting, along with his internal restlessness, became unbearable. Behind the scenes, Richard pushed for character evolution. He suggested giving John Boy more edge, internal conflict, or even darker motivations to reflect adulthood. But the show's formula, one that relied on idealized consistency, left little room for complexity. Despite his Emmy and growing stature, his input was often sidelined, and that lack of creative agency only worsened the feeling of being stuck. Scripts began to feel repetitive. He could predict John Boy's reactions and emotional beats before reading a single page. Worse still, his workload became heavier as storylines centered more and more on John Boy, making him not just a star, but the engine of a series. He was always on set, always performing, and had almost no space for himself or his artistic aspirations. When it came time for contract renegotiation, Richard asked for flexibility, a lighter filming schedule, and greater say in his character's direction. But the network refused. To them, John-Boy was essential and non-negotiable. The producers insisted on keeping him in every episode, in the same mold he had always filled. This rejection laid bare a harsh truth, that no matter how much he had contributed to the show's success, his creative desires weren't seen as essential. Worse still, whispers on set began that if he walked away, the role would simply be recast. The thought was jarring. John-Boy was so intrinsically tied to his own essence that seeing another actor step into the part felt surreal. And yet, that's exactly what happened. When he declined the offer, the network replaced him quickly with actor Robert Whiteman, without offering the audience any real explanation. Fans reacted with confusion and disappointment. Critics noted that something vital was missing, an emotional connection that couldn't be replicated. Richard, however, never spoke ill of the show or the new actor. He stepped away with quiet professionalism, despite the deep pain of leaving behind a role, a cast, and a world that had defined his early career. It had been like leaving home, but he knew staying would have cost him his artistic voice. Leaving the Waltons wasn't an impulsive decision. It was carefully considered, driven by a deep need to reclaim agency and identity. To many, walking away from a hit show at the height of its success might have seemed like career suicide, but to Richard, it was survival. He returned to the stage, his creative sanctuary, and began rebuilding his career from the ground up. He chose roles that were emotionally complex, morally ambiguous, even unsettling, characters who bore little resemblance to John-Boy. One of his earliest post-Walton performances was in You Like My Mother, where he played a mentally unstable Vietnam vet. It marked a sharp departure and signaled to the industry that he was capable of much more. It wasn't about shocking his audience, but reintroducing himself as a multidimensional actor. Still, the process was slow. Casting agents hesitated. Producers liked him but were unsure if John-Boy could handle darker material. Despite growing acclaim, the shadow of his early role loomed large. Interviews from that period reveal moments of quiet frustration. Richard spoke candidly about his gratitude for the Waltons, but he didn't shy away from admitting how confining it had been. He said the fame, though a blessing, had often felt like living in a fishbowl, with expectations too high and space to experiment too limited. He didn't regret the show, but he was clear it wasn't enough. Over time, his persistence began to pay off. Roles in prestige television, such as The Americans, Ozark, and Billions, allowed him to showcase his range and subtlety. His work on Broadway was equally acclaimed. Productions like Race and The Little Foxes re-established him as a serious stage actor. Though never one to dominate headlines, Richard built a consistent and respected career, known for integrity and dedication to craft rather than celebrity. John-Boy remained a part of his legacy, but no longer the only part. And interestingly, as years passed, Richard began to revisit his roots. Not with resentment, but with perspective. He began participating in retrospectives, interviews, and even lent his voice to narrate new Walton films on the CW. This wasn't a step back, but a full-circle gesture, showing peace with his past. He no longer needed the role to define him, but he honored what it once meant to him and to viewers. He acknowledged the impact of the Waltons with grace, but made clear that staying in that role indefinitely would have cost his growth, both professionally and personally. In recent interviews, he has reflected thoughtfully on the experience. He described leaving the show as one of the hardest decisions of his life, not out of bitterness, but because of deep affection for the cast, the crew, and the audience. But he knew that if he stayed, he risked never becoming the actor he truly wanted to be. He spoke of how overwhelming the public's expectations were, how being John-Boy in real life had felt more like performance than his actual acting. And though he once joked that auditions would go cold the moment casting agents saw John-Boy walk in, he never expressed bitterness. What he expressed was reflection, an acknowledgement of the challenge of fame at a young age, and the courage it took to leave it behind. Ultimately, Richard Thomas's story isn't just about leaving a role. It's about fighting for freedom to grow. In walking away from John-Boy Walton, he didn't reject the past. He embraced a future where he could finally step into roles that allowed him to be fully himself. And in doing so, he achieved something rare in Hollywood, not just longevity, but personal and artistic authenticity. His journey reminds us that sometimes the bravest act an artist can make is choosing not to be what the world wants him to be. but to become what they are meant to be. The decision to leave the Waltons wasn't simply a professional pivot for Richard Thomas. It was an existential shift. In a world where television actors often become inseparable from their most famous characters, Richard's choice signaled a rare act of self-determination. He chose to step away not because he rejected what the show represented, but because he recognized that growth could only come by shedding a skin that no longer fit. It wasn't lost on him that many child and young adult actors become trapped in the personas that catapulted them to fame. He had watched peers struggle to find serious work, or even peace of mind after early success. And he knew the longer he remained John-Boy, the harder it would be to escape the gravitational pull of that identity. Once free from the day-to-day demands of the Waltons, Richard immersed himself in work that stretched his emotional and psychological limits. He was drawn to theater not just for the craft, but for the anonymity. The stage didn't care that he had been a household name. What mattered was a moment, what you could summon in front of a live audience night after night. He took on difficult material, works by Shakespeare, Chekhov, Mamet, roles that required precision, patience, and deep empathy. Critics noted the surprising ferocity he brought to certain performances, especially when playing morally conflicted characters. The same vulnerability that had once made John-Boy so relatable now gave his darker roles emotional depth. He wasn't trying to erase the past. He was trying to evolve beyond it. The transition wasn't seamless. There were financial sacrifices, missed opportunities, and moments of doubt. He went from the pinnacle of primetime television to navigating the unpredictability of stage and independent projects. He also had to deal with an industry that, despite claiming to champion reinvention, rarely knew what to do with someone who had become a symbol. But Richard leaned into the discomfort. Instead of chasing stardom, he pursued meaning. That choice allowed him to build a career marked not by a single highlight, but by a mosaic of diverse, compelling performances. And then there was his personal life, a domain where the echoes of fame also reverberated. Being John-Boy didn't just shape how audiences saw him. It influenced relationships, friendships, and even how he saw himself. In interviews, Richard has alluded to a period of emotional reckoning in the years after the Waltons. He struggled to redefine not just his career, but his identity. Who was he outside of the role? What did he truly want? These questions are difficult for anyone, but even more so for someone whose life had played out under the watchful gaze of millions. He married Alma Gonzalez in 1975, and the couple had a son followed by triplet daughters. Fatherhood brought a kind of grounding that fame could never offer. He often credited his children with keeping him tethered to real life, reminding him daily of what mattered beyond scripts and cameras. However, like many in the entertainment world, his marriage eventually ended in divorce. Years later, he remarried Georgiana Bischoff, finding stability in a partnership that, by all accounts, brought him peace and clarity. Through it all, Richard remained remarkably centered, rarely indulging the drama that so often accompanies public lives. His commitment to privacy was a quiet rebellion in a culture obsessed with access. Meanwhile, the legacy of the Waltons continued to ripple through American culture. As television evolved into more cynical or gritty territory, the show retained its unique place as a symbol of family values and emotional honesty. And as time passed, people began to rediscover the series, not just as nostalgia, but as a kind of cultural balm. In this reappraisal, Richard's portrayal of John-Boy took on renewed meaning. Viewers could now see the subtlety in his performance, the way he conveyed empathy without sentimentality or idealism without naivety. It became clear that what Richard brought to the role couldn't be replicated. His departure may have marked a loss at the time, but it also helped elevate the performance into something mythic. In later years, Richard began engaging more openly with the legacy of the show. He participated in anniversary specials, reunion interviews, and fan conventions. But he did so with balance, honoring the past without being consumed by it. This ability to return without regressing is what sets him apart. While many actors either disown their breakout roles or cling to them desperately, Richard managed to strike a middle path. He showed that it's possible to be grateful for what a role gave you while still insisting on your own evolution. His role in The Americans, a critically acclaimed spy drama, was perhaps the ultimate vindication of his long, slow journey toward reinvention. Cast as a duplicitous Agent Frank Gadd, he was steely, guarded, and morally ambiguous, a world away from the open-hearted John-Boy. And yet, the performance worked precisely because of the trust and empathy Richard naturally radiated. It made the character's internal contradictions more compelling. Suddenly, directors and audiences alike were reminded of the depth he could bring. His work in Ozark and Billions only reinforced the point. Here was an actor who had not only survived the spotlight of early fame, but transcended it. Beyond the screen and stage, Richard has also become something of a quiet mentor and role model in the industry. Younger actors often speak of his generosity, his discipline, and his willingness to offer guidance without ego. He's been through the industry's highs and lows, and has emerged not bitter or jaded, but thoughtful and steady. He's talked about the importance of resilience, of staying curious, and of never allowing one chapter to define your whole story. In an era where burnout and disillusionment are common among actors, his longevity feels almost radical. His journey also highlights a broader truth about storytelling and identity in the entertainment world. For too long, actors were expected to pick a lane, be a star, a character actor, or romantic lead, and stay there. Reinvention was often punished rather than rewarded. But Richard Thomas's career is a case study in what happens when an artist insists on multidimensionality. By resisting the industry's urge to reduce him to a single archetype, he opened the door for a more expansive kind of artistry, one that doesn't fear evolution, but embraces it. He has said in interviews that the true reward of acting lies not in fame or accolades, but in connection. Whether on screen or stage, it's about telling the truth of a character, offering audiences a mirror, a question, a glimpse of something real. That philosophy has guided him across decades and genres, and it explains why his performances continue to resonate. There's no artifice in his work. Even when playing villains or morally conflicted men, he never loses that core humanity. In recent years, as the Waltons has found new life through reboots and special episodes, Richard has re-entered the fold not as John-Boy, but as narrator, a symbolic gesture that feels fitting. He no longer needs to be the face of the show. His voice, measured, familiar, wise, is enough. It's a testament to his enduring presence and to the trust audiences still place in him. It's also a reminder that the stories we tell as young people can have new meaning when revisited with the clarity of age. As he enters the twilight of a long and multifaceted career, Richard Thomas stands as a rare figure in American entertainment. A child star who became a serious actor, a television icon who embraced the stage, and a cultural figure who transcended his most famous role. His life story offers a quiet but powerful rebuke to the idea that fame must define you, or that growth must come at the cost of gratitude. He has managed to hold both, the memory of John-Boy and the freedom of reinvention, with grace and humility. For viewers who grew up with the Waltons, Richard Thomas will always be part of their emotional DNA. But for those who followed him beyond that mountain house, he represents something even more valuable, the possibility of change. His career is proof that it's never too late to rewrite your narrative, never too late to choose growth over comfort, art over applause. And in doing so, he has crafted a legacy not just as John-Boy Walton, but as Richard Thomas, the actor, the artist, the man who walked away and never looked back with regret. Richard Thomas didn't just outgrow a role. He redefined what it means to take your legacy into your own hands. The Waltons gave him a voice, but he spent the rest of his life learning how to use it for himself. His story is a rare one in Hollywood. Not a scandal or collapse, but of quiet reinvention. From stage to screen, he proved that you can walk away from the role that made you and still become more. If you found this story as moving as we did, hit that like button. It helps more people rediscover the depth behind the faces they grew up with. Let us know in the comments. What do you remember most about John-Boy